There's another thread I would love to cover that I think that links these conversations, which is game theory, and is the idea of the games we're playing. So we all know and are familiar with the current game of extractive capitalism. We're all familiar with that in some sense. I think what's exciting and what's quite psychedelic really is the concept of how to either play the game really differently or play a completely new game, which for me has always been the essence and the promise of the psychedelic experience. And I think there's also other areas where it spans into. We focus a lot on the medicinal. There's also the ceremonial and the various ways that looks, how that plays out. There's the underground. There's so many different brands to it as well, which might be fun to explore. But it would be cool to look at this concept of the different games we could be playing and maybe start at that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can slice and dice this any way we want, right? But at least a way it occurs to me to think of it just based on what seems to be happening in the space is you have the finite game. Let's just say this is the pharmacological medical model with big pharma, with venture capital, with all the bits and pieces that we've, kind of explored. And you've got both, cynical bad actors in that space, which we kind of have flagged at least, at least as far as archetypes or potentials. We haven't necessarily been calling folks out. But then there's also good actors within that finite game, incredibly good-hearted people attempting to engage with market-based solutions to get this healing out into the world. And I think one of the key things there is sort of like, okay, so if you're going to say we're not blowing up the entire macroeconomic system to try and reinvent something else as a vessel or a vehicle for psychedelic therapies to get into the world, so we're going to work with what we've got. That's plausible, that's reasonable, that's sane, it's pragmatic. And it's also timely, it's efficient. Now, there are a few software patches. Right. So rather than starting from scratch with a tabula rasa kind of thing, there are a few software patches that you can make. And the obvious ones are things like benefit corps. Like how do you incorporate and what are your terms of capital and investment and return? And so for anybody, I mean, most folks are deeply familiar with benefit corps at this point, but just that idea of, hey, we put into our operating agreements and our shareholder agreements and our governance structures something other than bottom line shareholder fiduciary responsibility. And we add in environment, communities, employees, stakeholders, the kind of stakeholder model. So people, profit, planet, whatever, fill in the blank on those, but something that actually at the inception or instantiation of the organization or in the reception of capital and the establishment of governance, you bake that in. And a really good example of that I just continually find useful. One of our friends is one of the partners at Greylock Ventures in Silicon Valley, Sand Hill Road, one of the biggest ones. Reid Hoffman is a partner there from LinkedIn, as well as others. And they stood up something called the Brain Mind Conference at Stanford and Harvard and MIT. And one in four papers presented at that conference were about ketamine therapy and psychedelic therapies. And their general premise at Greylock was to say, hey, we believe that most funds look for 10x returns, but they know that 9 out of 10 of their babies die. They die in the crib, they don't launch. So it's good money after bad, but 1 in 10 hits, and they have to have a 10x return to cover your spread on the rest of the portfolio. What that does, though, is that leaves all sorts of pro-social and important innovations and research underfunded, even though it ought to be in the world. So they articulated this space of the 1 to 3x return. And that sense of you can think about it like self-replenishing philanthropy. You can think of it as CSR, corporate social responsibility. You can think of it in a bunch of different buckets. But basically our fiduciary commitment as an organization, which prevents a lot of those market dynamics creating shitty outcomes, is to say, we want to give you your money back. We want you to invest in us, give us rocket fuel to get to liftoff. Once we have it, we can then become self-perpetuating. So instead of a black tie gala dinner every year where you get hit up for another check to replenish the leaky bucket of a do-gooder nonprofit that can't stand on its own feet, you get to either double down on us because you're like, hey, these guys are getting traction and we want to continue adding fuel to that, or you take your money back out and redeploy it. And then a cap of 3x return, which is to say, hey, this is a pro-social benefit mission. We don't want to over harvest, right? Therefore, once 3 times return, pretty damn good money. Like most people would sign up for that, especially in this age of artificially depressed interest rates on all other, a whole bunch of other asset classes. And can we play that game? And then another one is potentially the notion of reverse tithing, where this is not dissimilar to the 1 to 3x, but it's to say, hey, if what we're building is a network-based economy, right? In the sense that user-generated content, user contribution, you could think of Facebook and YouTube as, dot one examples of this, but wait, all those guys did was build a software pattern. It's the bajillions of people filming and uploading their content that creates the value in that ecosystem. So the notion of reverse tithing for capital could be, hey, if what we're building is a meshwork ecosystem of humans, right, doing things together, and that the exponential value comes from the entire network, then we pledge never to extract more than 10% of net profits out of that system, because otherwise that's siphoning. It's like constantly chopping down a forest instead of letting the entire thing grow together and stitch together. So those kind of notions, 1 to 3x return, benefit corps or other forms of legal structures and entity structures, and socializing and then delivering on some version of reverse tithing, I would see those as all possible software patches that allow well-intentioned actors not to get hijacked by the market dynamics, by the kind of game theory of the finite market game everybody's playing.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning, doing a few shout outs to people who are doing that. So there's the North Star Pledge, who are working very hard to create an ethics pledge that may well go into, for example, shareholder agreements, et cetera. I think that's I think it's an interesting area. There's also there's organizations that are trying to do that in other areas, trying to create some kind of system of checks and balances in the ceremonial spaces, like one is called Guild of Guides, for example. So there are things happening in the community, and IP defense funds as well are forming. That's what Tim Ferriss was asking. Is anyone doing this? I just spoke to Graham Pachenik, the psychedelic IP lawyer, who first kind of broke the story of Compass Pathways' most recent patent application. And he was talking about there's very simple things you can do, like, for example, creating enough information for patent officers. It was actually quite interesting. He was talking about how patent officers have 3 hours per patent application, and they're meant to put themselves in the mindset of, okay, what is this industry and where's this application coming from? But they don't know about psychedelic research, so there's an education job to be done. So I think there are simple processes that can be done right now within the game that people are doing. And so I think that, it's really worth mentioning. However, there are also, it's a very tricky field to navigate. This has always been the conversation I have with Kat Knorr, North Star, and others involved in that. It's like, yes, but there are other players who are bigger, stronger, and faster than a B Corp might be. It's a tricky thing to be competitive in a different way in a hyper-competitive environment. So I'm curious what the response to that might be. What's a response we could have to that? Take it to the next level.
I mean, the bottom line when you're saying, hey, more cynical, better resource folks with legal teams on retainer and all that kind of thing, they can just do slap suits. So, strategic lawsuits against public participation, which is just, we'll just gunge up you silly little nonprofit with barely 2 nickels to rub together, and we will just outlast you. We will just bury you in litigation and drag this out for years. And again, back to the notion of the passage of time as a competitive advantage. Like, ambiguity over time allows decisive actors to keep acting. So they don't actually have to win the day. They don't actually have to persuade anybody of anything. All they have to do is keep it uncertain while they still strip mine. Right. So there is that. Now, you already hinted at it with IP and some of those elements. And actually, Daniel Schmachtenberger, that many folks on your channel are familiar with, he said something which I think is probably holds up, which is the idea that if you want to start transitioning out of rivalrous games or finite games, you kind of actually have to win the last round of that and then call the new game. right? It's like, this is not 5-card stud anymore. Jokers aren't wild, and here's the deal. We're all going to play and we're all going to get along, right? But you actually have to, paradoxically, win at the game you've determined is anathema, so that you are then in a position of optionality. And this was a couple of years ago, maybe only 18 months ago, but this was actually when North Star was first ginning things up. And Bob Jesse, who was another member of the old guard of the psychedelic community in the Bay Area, had already taken a crack at a pledge. And this is probably now, I suppose, 2 or even 3 years ago, had folks sign it. And what was interesting there was you had good actors opting not to sign it for specific and principled reasons. But you also had bad actors opting to sign it, right? And kind of sneaking in under the church tent. So the enforceability was zilch, optics were muddied. And that was that's been my first filter with North Star and others, which is does this actually filter out good and bad actors? And is it in any way, does it have any teeth or penalty for defection, right? So that was, and then I asked, Daniel's and our mutual friend Jordan Hall. I was like, okay, so let me run this past you. Give me your game theory assessment. And his sort of, Mr. Spock Mentat assessment. He was like, ran all the million probabilities and was like, okay, here's the deal. This is what you need to do. You actually need to steer into this gate. You can't say, hey, it's psychedelics are groovy. Let's create a new kumbaya economy. There, anything that can be weaponized in a game theoretic construct will be. So beat them to the weapons cache, right? And get in there and patent the living shit out of everything, right? Because that is ultimately the end game here. Is this is Warren Buffett 101: build castles and moats, right? Build high ground that is defensible and make it hard for anybody else to get up there. Right. And Peter Thiel, who is a backer of Compass, famously said in his own book, competition is overrated, monopolies are where it's at. So we ought to expect that. And you can have pledges, you can do all the things, just that the push of capital will get us to that place willy-nilly. So a thought here, and this goes from good actors doing their level best inside the finite game. And, by the way, there's companies like Patagonia. There's lots of social benefit companies that have done amazing things inside the economic system with intentional software patches. They're saying, we're not going to play the race to the bottom game. We're going to play the best possible version within this structure. So that's absolutely possible. The culture jamming ones are things like, if you take a look at all the players in the space, give them more of what they want. Don't try and persuade them that they're wrong or bad for wanting what they want, right? So if you look at researchers, what do researchers want? Researchers want high quality data that they can assess and analyze and then publish in peer-reviewed journals to get tenure. That's what they want, right? What do entrepreneurs want? Entrepreneurs want capital to launch their dream and vision. What do therapists and people in the helping professions gather around this? They want clients. They want a pipeline of people that they can help and serve, right? So you're like, okay. And then what do investors want? Particularly in this space, some form of impact investing. They want integrity. They don't want to be taken for a fool. They don't want there to be good money after bad. They want to see positive ethical impact aligned with their values. So you're like, okay, fantastic. So now we've got the landscape. Let's give everybody what they want. Right. And let's create a confederacy. And the key here, I think, is two. One is everyone who's a signatory gains access to the aggregate network effects of that platform. Right. So like the UN, like you don't have to belong to the UN. If you want to be in North Korea, if you want to be in Iran, you can do that 100%. You just don't have access to, and granted, it's a muddy record in the last 12 months, but you don't have access to global public health data. You don't have access to favored loans. You don't have access to be a signatory on mutual defense treaties, right? Or open borders or trade agreements, right? So you can play outside the network if you want. It's 100% optional. However, the aggregate network effects are compelling enough to entice people to come into it. So rather than enforcement, you want to have attraction, right? So because enforcement will always lose against better resourced, more cynical players, right? But if you have a positive network effect of, hey, we are a confederacy. This is the psychedelic confederacy. right, representing all the stakeholders, and the signatories agree to share data. So amazing. I don't have to be paying grad students $25 an hour to try and get this tiny little N sample size. I actually have hundreds or thousands or millions of bits of data to play with now. Amazing. I'm in. And I will agree to reciprocate, like Linux or an open source software community. The investors are like, great. I have people that I know aren't going to cynically exploit this, create bad PR, blowback from my family office or venture fund or whatever it would be. So that's awesome. If you have aggregate media marketing, ad spend, and storytelling, so that you can, and you have a directory like, hey, find a psychedelic alliance therapist in your town, punch in your zip code, and here's the 3 people that are there. You can start directing clients to those folks, right? So it's you start seeing how that could work. And I think the keys there would be researchers committing to open source data sharing, for people within the alliance, and, say the top 10 most visible investors committing to say, we're actually not going to fund any shadier shit than this. Like, this is our ISO 9000, this is our certification level in order to be eligible for investment. And granted, there's going to be sovereign wealth funds. There's going to be, Bitcoin bros. There's going to be folks that do the end runs. Absolutely. But you just build the system on positive attraction to steer into the skid of all the market dynamics. And then, oh, by the way, we flooded the zone with a very aggressive and creative IP strategy, such that all of them are now open source Creative Commons, provided you don't do any of the smash and grabs and extract value out of the system. So something comparable to like a Creative Commons license, where like, hey, feel free to use it, share it, distribute it, but name check it and cite it, and don't turn a buck on it.